After my husband died, my own son left me with nothing but a simple wooden box in the will, thinking I was just a powerless, grieving widow. He and his wife gloated over their new multi-million-dollar empire, treating me with such smug pity while they isolated me in my own home. Little did they know that worthless box held the key to their downfall, and my justice was going to be served cold, right in the middle of their very first board meeting. The house was full of ghosts, and not just my husband's. The ghosts of 40 years of laughter of arguments, settled on the chintz sofa of children growing up and leaving their own faint imprints on the air. Now it was filled with the low murmur of polite grief, the clinking of glasses, and the scent of lilies, which I've always found far too sweet for sorrow. I moved through the rooms of my own home a ghost myself, accepting condolences from people whose names flickered at the edge of my memory. My son Jonathan and his wife Melissa were the masters of ceremony for this somber affair. They flanked me like a royal guard, a whirlwind of performative sadness. Melissa would clutch a guest's arm, her eyes wide with a carefully practiced sorrow, while Jonathan would shake a hand, his face a mask of dutiful mourning. But their grief felt brittle, like a thin veneer of ice over something turbulent. I saw it in the way Melissa's smile never quite reached her eyes, and more clearly in Jonathan. My son kept glancing at his phone, a quick, furtive movement, his thumb scrolling, as if searching for a message that was long overdue. It was the nervous energy of a man waiting for stock market results, not a son mourning his father. A deep, quiet ache lived in my chest, a hollow space where Arthur used to be. Their frantic energy was a discordant note against my silent pain. In the days that followed the funeral, a new kind of quiet descended on the house, one that felt less like peace and more like insulation. Jonathan and Melissa began their campaign of what they called protective care. It started small. Melissa would answer the house phone, her voice syrupy and concerned, telling whoever was on the line that I was resting and simply too distraught to speak. At first, I was grateful. The thought of making small talk was exhausting. But then I missed a call from an old friend from the country club and another from one of Arthur's colleagues on the board. When I asked about it, Melissa just patted my hand and said she was handling everything, so I wouldn't have to worry. They were building a wall around me brick by well-intentioned brick, and I was too tired to notice I was being sealed inside. The true betrayal, when it came, was as quiet and unassuming as the rustle of paper. Jonathan brought his new lawyer to the house, a young man with a sharp suit and an easy smile that didn't seem entirely genuine. He spread a fan of documents across Arthur's mahogany desk in the library. He explained they were just routine estate papers, things to get the process started before the formal will reading. My mind was a fog of grief and logistics. I just wanted it to be over. The lawyer guided my hand, pointing to various signature lines, his explanations a smooth, calming drone. On one page, he paused. He told me this was just a simple formality to streamline the process for everyone, a waiver of independent counsel for the reading. He said it would make things quicker, less stressful. Trusting my son, who nodded in agreement, and wanting nothing more than to retreat back into my quiet sorrow, I signed without a second thought. I gave away my right to a defender without even knowing I was in a fight. That evening, the house was finally silent. Jonathan and Melissa had gone to their own home, leaving me to the ghosts and the memories. I sought refuge in the library, Arthur's favorite room, sinking into his worn leather armchair. I must have drifted off because I was startled by the sound of Jonathan's voice from the hallway. He must have come back for something. He wasn't speaking loudly, but his voice was a low, panicked whisper that cut through the silence. I held my breath, listening. He said the reading was on Tuesday, and that it had to be enough. He told the person on the other end that no, she had no idea. He said that once he was in control, the funds would be liquid in a week. He just needed a week. His voice cracked with a desperate plea when he told them they couldn't call the debt before then. The words hung in the air, each one a tiny shard of ice against my skin. Debt. Control. She has no idea. A cold, terrifying clarity pierced through the fog of my grief. My husband was gone, and I was completely and utterly alone in a house that was no longer my own. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now, let's get back to it. The 2 days between overhearing my son's phone call and the will reading were the longest of my life. The fog of grief had been burned away by the cold fire of betrayal, replaced by a sharp, painful clarity. I moved through my home. I sat at my vanity. I answered Jonathan and Melissa's cloying questions. But I was no longer just a grieving widow. I was a general studying a battlefield, and every polite smile was a strategic maneuver. When Tuesday arrived, I dressed not in the soft gray of mourning, but in a navy blue suit Arthur had always loved, its sharp lines a silent armor. The law office was as sterile and impersonal as I'd imagined. Jonathan's slick young lawyer sat at the head of a polished table that reflected the grim sky outside. I sat opposite him with Jonathan and a preening Melissa to my left. The lawyer read the will in a monotone drone that sucked the life out of Arthur's final words. As expected, the bulk of the estate, the house, the portfolio, and crucially, the controlling interest in Elba Industries went to Jonathan. I watched Melissa's lips curl into a triumphant smirk that she tried to hide behind a delicate hand. Jonathan sat a little straighter, the tense line of his shoulders finally relaxing. The lawyer then announced that I was to receive my personal effects, a generous lifelong stipend, and a small, unadorned wooden box from Arthur's study. This was the moment. Melissa leaned in her hand, reaching for mine in a gesture of patronizing pity, her mouth forming words of empty consolation. I ignored her completely. My gaze was fixed on the lawyer. In a voice that was perfectly calm and clear, a voice that did not tremble, I made my first move. I asked him if there was any mention of the chairman's codicil that Arthur had drafted years ago with his original counsel, Mr. David Chen. The question hit the silent room like a physical blow. Jonathan froze his face, a mask of sudden shock. I saw him shoot a panicked, furious look at Melissa. The young lawyer, so smooth and confident moments before, began fumbling through his papers, his cheeks flushing red. He stammered that there was no such document on file, nothing like that at all. Jonathan recovered quickly, but his recovery was clumsy. He let out a laugh that was far too loud for the small room. He told me I must be confused that Dad and David Chen hadn't worked together in years. He said I was misremembering things in my grief, but it was too much, too aggressive. Their shared panic was a flare in the dark, confirming everything. They knew exactly what I was talking about. That afternoon, I returned to the house alone, clutching the simple wooden box. It felt cool and solid in my hands, a final tangible piece of my husband. In the quiet of my bedroom, I retrieved a small, unassuming cell phone from the back of my jewelry box. Arthur had given it to me years ago, calling it his break glass in case of emergency phone. He'd told me to keep it charged and hidden just in case. I finally understood what kind of emergency he'd anticipated. My hands were steady as I dialed the only number stored in it. A familiar, gravelly voice answered. It was David Chen, the wise, loyal counsel Jonathan had pushed out of the company for being too much like his father. I kept my words simple. I told him it was Sabrina and that I would like to have lunch. Then I added that I was bringing a puzzle Arthur had left for me. A long silence followed, and then David simply said he would clear his schedule. My first ally was in place. My quiet victory was short-lived. That evening, Jonathan and Melissa returned their anxiety, now a buzzing, frantic energy. Their panic was making them sloppy. Jonathan announced that for safekeeping, they should take the wooden box to their bank vault. He said it was too valuable to be left lying around. Melissa chimed in, her voice dripping with false concern, saying I wasn't well, that I was vulnerable, and they needed to manage these things for me. She reached for the box on the mantelpiece, but I stepped in front of her. I wrapped my hands around it. When I simply told her no, the word was quiet, but it was made of iron. They both stopped stunned. They tried to insist, their tone hardening their pleas about my well-being, becoming thin justifications for a demand. They tried to physically take it from me, their hands covering mine. But I held on my grip, unyielding, and looked directly into my son's eyes. For the first time, he saw not a grieving, docile mother, but the woman who had stood beside his father for 40 years. They retreated, defeated and unnerved, leaving the house in a storm of unspoken threats. The battle lines had been drawn, and the prize was a simple wooden box. After our confrontation, I knew my only advantage was the one they had handed to me, their belief that I was weak. So I began to act the part. I let them help me, allowing Jonathan to sort through minor household bills and nodding vacantly as Melissa rearranged the pantry. I became the frail, grieving widow they so desperately wanted me to be. When they would ask about the wooden box, I'd give them a sad, watery smile and speak of it as a precious container of old love letters and photographs, my last connection to Arthur. I watched them closely. At first, their gazes were sharp, hawk-like, searching for any sign of deception. But as the days passed and I appeared to sink deeper into a quiet, sentimental grief, I saw their arrogance return. They decided my question at the will reading had been a lucky guess, a ghost of a memory from a confused old woman. They were back in control. It was exactly what I wanted them to believe. Of course, at the time, I didn't know the full extent of their terror. I would only learn the details later, a sordid story of desperation that explained but did not excuse their cruelty. What I couldn't see then was them driving through town, their conversation tense, only to have a sleek black town car pull up alongside them at a stoplight. The window would glide down, and the man in the back would simply stare at them, a silent, terrifying message that their time was running out. The story, as I eventually pieced it together, was a classic tragedy of greed. They had been seduced by a charismatic con man who promised impossible returns on a new tech venture. Convinced they were smarter than everyone else, they had secretly taken out massive personal loans leveraged against Jonathan's future inheritance. When the venture inevitably collapsed, it left them owing $8 million to a ruthless private equity firm. The kind of firm that doesn't break kneecaps, but methodically destroys lives and reputations for sport. Their abject terror was the fuel for their aggression toward me. I was the last barrier to the money they needed to save themselves. While they were living in that private hell, I was preparing my counteroffensive. I met David Chen at a discreet Italian restaurant far from our usual Greenwich circles. He was older now, his hair completely white, but his eyes were as sharp as I remembered. In the privacy of a back room, I placed the wooden box on the table between us. He looked at it, then at me, and gave a small, sad smile. He told me Arthur always did love his puzzles. Together we opened it. Just as I had told my son, the top layer was filled with old photos and bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon. For a moment, my heart sank. But David, ever the meticulous lawyer, ran his fingers along the inside of the box. His touch was light-searching. He paused, then pressed firmly on a small, almost invisible knot in the wood. We heard a soft click. He lifted out a false bottom. There was no stock certificate. There was no new will. There was only a single, ornate, old-fashioned key, and one folded sheet of notarized paper. David unfolded it, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. His breath caught. He explained that it was an irrevocable proxy. The document granted the legal holder of the key the sole and absolute voting rights for Arthur's entire 51% share block in Elba Industries. The shares were in Jonathan's name, but the power, all of it, was in my hand. Arthur had protected me. He had trusted me. We sat there in the quiet room, the key lying on the table like a scepter, and we began to plan. Jonathan, however, was not a man to wait. Flush with his perceived victory, and with the silent pressure of his creditors mounting every day, he made the critical error of a desperate amateur. David called me late that afternoon. Jonathan had used his new authority as majority shareholder to call an emergency board meeting for the upcoming Friday. The agenda had a single item: his official and immediate confirmation as the new chairman and CEO. He had told the board it was to ensure a smooth and rapid transition for the sake of the company. David said the move was arrogant and so rushed that it was raising eyebrows all over the financial district, but legally, no one could challenge the man who held the majority of the shares. Jonathan had just handed us our battlefield, our weapon, and our timeline. And he had no idea he was marching his army directly into my line of fire. On Friday morning, I was not in the Elba Industries boardroom. Instead, I was in the small private anteroom that adjoined it, a place normally used for serving coffee. The heavy oak door was cracked open just enough for me to see the long, polished table and the somber-suited figures of the company's directors. My heart ached as I saw my son Jonathan standing at the head of it all, in the chair that had been his father's for 40 years. He was delivering a speech, a eulogy for Arthur that seamlessly morphed into a vision statement for his own leadership. His voice was confident, almost arrogant, the voice of a man who believed he had already won. I watched him, and for a fleeting moment, the strategist in me gave way to the mother, and I felt a profound sadness for the boy he once was, and the desperate man he had become. I held my breath, waiting for the signal. Just as Jonathan was winding down, preparing to call for the vote that would make his control absolute, the boardroom doors opened with a soft, authoritative click. David Chen entered. He looked calm, dignified, and completely in charge. A murmur went through the room. The older board members recognized him immediately, their faces a mixture of surprise and curiosity. David walked halfway to the table and stopped. He apologized for the interruption, his voice respectful but firm enough to command the attention of everyone present. He then announced that he was there as legal counsel for the majority shareholder. Jonathan actually laughed. It was a sharp, dismissive sound that echoed in the tense silence. He told David that he was the majority shareholder and that he thought David should leave. David didn't flinch. He simply walked the rest of the way to the table and, with a quiet deliberation that was devastating to watch, placed the irrevocable proxy document and the single ornate key on the polished wood. The company's general counsel, a cautious man named Peterson, hesitantly picked up the document. As he read, I saw the color drain from his face. His eyes darted from the page to the key, and then to Jonathan. In a choked whisper that seemed to carry to every corner of the room, he said that it was legally binding. Every eye in the room swiveled to my son. His face, just moments before so full of arrogant confidence, simply collapsed. The mask shattered, and the terrified man underneath was laid bare for all to see. The pressure valve that had been holding him together for weeks finally exploded. He began to ramble, his voice cracking, the words spilling out in a torrent of panicked confession. He spoke of the bad investment, the charismatic con man who had swindled them, the millions in debt he owed to men who would destroy him. He told them all about the threats, the sleepless nights, the crushing weight of his failure. He was pleading now, his eyes darting around the room, looking for an ally for anyone. He cried out that he had to do it, that they didn't understand the pressure, that it was the only way to save himself. Melissa, who had been sitting like a statue against the wall, jumped to her feet and tried to rush forward, her voice a sharp hiss as she told Jonathan to stop. But it was far too late. His confession hung in the air, a toxic cloud of shame and desperation. The other board members' men who had played golf with Arthur, men who had watched my son grow up, stared at him. Their faces were not angry, but something far worse, a mixture of shock and profound, irrevocable disappointment. The few allies Jonathan had on the board pointedly looked away, studying their notes, as if they could will themselves invisible. His grand conspiracy of two had evaporated, exposing nothing but a pathetic, high-stakes gamble made by a frightened boy in a man's suit. That was my cue. The doors to the anteroom opened, and I walked in. I was dressed in the sharp navy blue suit, my back straight, my gaze fixed on the men at the table. A collective gasp went through the room as all eyes turned to me. I radiated a quiet, unshakable power that I had not felt in years. I did not look at my son or his wife. I addressed the board directly, my voice as calm and steady as if I were discussing the weather. I announced that it appeared we had serious matters to discuss regarding the fiscal health and the judgment of our acting CEO. I declared that the vote for chairman was postponed indefinitely. Then, with a finality that left no room for argument, I told them the meeting was adjourned. My control was absolute. I turned and walked out, leaving Jonathan and Melissa standing alone in the silent, cavernous boardroom, utterly and completely powerless. The week between the two board meetings was a study in contrasts. For me, it was a period of intense, focused work, with David poring over company bylaws and financial documents. For the rest of our small Greenwich world, it was a week of whispered phone calls and canceled lunch plans. The shockwaves from Jonathan's public confession had spread instantly, and my son and his wife found themselves socially isolated in a way that only our community can engineer. When we all gathered again in the Elba Industries boardroom exactly 1 week later, the atmosphere was thick with a solemn, final tension. There was no shock left, only the heavy weight of impending judgment. This time, I sat where I belonged at the head of the table in my husband's chair. Placed neatly beside my notes was the single ornate key, a quiet but undeniable symbol of my authority. Jonathan and Melissa were present as their board positions required, but they were relegated to lesser chairs against the wall, far from the center of power. They were observers at their own execution. Jonathan looked diminished, his face pale and drawn, his eyes fixed on the polished surface of the table. Melissa sat beside him, radiating a silent, venomous resentment. They were stripped of all authority, and they knew it. I did not begin with accusations or recriminations. I did not raise my voice. With David Chen sitting to my right, I began to systematically present a case. My argument was not about the personal betrayal of a mother, but about the professional malfeasance of a CEO. I spoke of fiduciary duty, of reputational risk, of the sacred trust between a company and its leadership. Then David presented the evidence he had uncovered during his review of the company's recent financials. He showed the board formal applications signed by Jonathan, attempting to secure a multi-million-dollar line of credit against the company's core assets. The stated purpose was a vague, strategic investment, but the timing coincided perfectly with the deadline his creditors had given him. He had been willing to risk the entire corporation, his father's life's work, to cover his personal debt. The case was factual, cold, and utterly devastating. There was no defense. The true judgment, however, came not from me, but from the room. Before I could even call for a motion, George, my husband's oldest friend and the most senior member of the board, cleared his throat. He was a man of few words, and when he spoke, everyone listened. He didn't look at me. He looked directly at my son. His voice was not angry, but filled with a deep, sorrowful disappointment that was far more cutting. He said that they had all known Jonathan his whole life. He said to think that he would risk his father's legacy, the company they had all built together, just to cover a personal mistake. He paused, and his final words landed like a death blow. He said that Arthur would be ashamed. In the culture of our world, that statement was a fate worse than bankruptcy. It was social and professional execution. It was the end. That was all that was needed. I calmly called the vote. The motion was to remove Jonathan from his executive position and from the board of directors, effective immediately. The vote was unanimous. A second motion to launch a full-scale internal audit of all his recent financial activities also passed unanimously. The formal justice had been served. Then I delivered the final personal consequences. I looked at my son for the first time that day, my voice leaving no room for appeal. I informed him that Elba Industries would not be involved in his personal financial matters. He and his wife were on their own. With that, I had reclaimed control, nullified their power, and delivered a justice that was not born of rage but of necessity. It was proportionate, public, and surgically precise. The aftermath was as swift and brutal as a winter storm. In a town like Greenwich, news travels faster than gossip, and the verdict of the Elba Industries Board was effectively a public decree. Jonathan's creditors, who had been circling like vultures, descended the moment they knew the company would not be his safety net. I didn't watch it happen, but I heard about it, of course. There was a frantic fire sale of their assets, the sprawling mansion with its perfectly manicured lawns, the European cars, the art Melissa had so proudly collected. It was all sold for pennies on the dollar to satisfy the debts. More devastating for them, however, was the social fallout. Their names vanished from the guest lists of the charity galas and country club events that had defined their existence. The phones stopped ringing. Their powerful friends suddenly had full calendars. In the world they had tried so desperately to conquer, they had become ghosts overnight. From the ashes of their old life, my son and his wife took two very different paths. I learned through David that Jonathan, stripped of his arrogance and public pride, was profoundly broken. The words of his father's old friend, that Arthur would be ashamed, had shattered him in a way no financial loss ever could. He took a modest financial analyst job in another state, a humbling fall from the executive suite. I received a short formal letter from him 6 months later. It didn't ask for forgiveness, but it was the first time I had ever heard him take full accountability for his own choices. It was the beginning of a long, slow journey toward understanding the depth of his entitlement and his failure. Melissa, however, could not accept a life without status. She saw their downfall not as a consequence of their actions, but as a personal attack orchestrated by me. She remained bitter, resentful, and unable to cope with a life devoid of wealth and prestige. Before the year was out, she left him. While their world was shrinking, mine was expanding in ways I never expected. Taking my husband's seat at the head of that table felt less like a victory and more like a homecoming. I discovered that the skills I had honed for decades as the silent strategic partner in Arthur's life were exactly what the company needed. I combined my late husband's wisdom and his cautious principles with my own keen modern instincts. Under my leadership, Elba Industries entered a new period of stability and, more importantly, ethical growth. The internal audit had been painful but necessary, and we emerged stronger. My most important act as chairman, however, was creating the Arthur P. Elba Foundation for Financial Literacy. Using a portion of the company's profits, we established a program to help educate communities and protect people from the very kind of sophisticated scams that had so thoroughly ruined my son. It was a way to turn our family's pain into a shield for others. Months later, I am chairing a successful quarterly meeting. The boardroom is filled with the familiar faces of the directors, but the atmosphere is different. Now it's one of mutual respect and quiet confidence. I feel perfectly in my element, leading a discussion on future growth, my voice steady and sure. On the corner of the vast polished table sits the simple wooden box, its lid slightly ajar. It has a permanent place here now. It is no longer a symbol of what little I was left in a will, but a testament to the immense power I have always held. In this new reality, I have transformed the ache of grief and the sting of betrayal, not into bitterness, but into a purposeful stewardship. I have secured my husband's legacy, and in doing so, I have finally, completely reclaimed my own. Sabrina's story teaches us that the greatest strength is often the quietest hidden beneath years of grace and observation. It shows that true justice isn't about inflicting pain, but about restoring balance with precision and purpose. Her victory wasn't just in reclaiming what was hers, but in transforming a deep personal betrayal into a lasting legacy of protection for others. She reminds us that the ultimate power lies not just in winning a fight, but in having the wisdom and strength to build something better and more resilient from the wreckage.